a $4 million car, a ballroom full of billionaires, and a single father with grease still under his fingernails who just said 6 words that made the entire room go quiet. I can fix it in 90 seconds. They laughed at him. Every single one of them laughed. This is the story of what happened next, and why, by the end of the night, not one person in that ballroom was laughing anymore. If this story hits you somewhere real, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. The Hargrove Grand didn't do anything quietly. From the street, 40 stories below the rooftop terrace, the building looked like a lit matchstick stabbed into the Chicago skyline. All glass and steel and light, the kind of architectural statement that costs $300 million to make and another $300 million to maintain. On any other Saturday night in November, the upper floors hosted corporate galas, retirement dinners, the occasional tech launch that tried too hard to feel like a cultural event. Standard business, standard Chicago. But tonight was different. Tonight was the Sterling Cardiac Foundation Gala, and every person who mattered in this city, and a fair number who mattered in cities much farther away, had paid $40,000 per plate to be inside that ballroom. The invitations had gone out 4 months ago on cream-colored cardstock with a small embossed silver heart in the upper left corner. No QR code, no email confirmation link. If you didn't already know the address of the Hargrove Grand, the assumption was that you probably shouldn't be coming. Arya Sterling had approved the invitations herself. She'd approved the menu, the floral arrangements, white peonies and dark calla lilies, nothing that screamed charity event, and the seating chart, which had taken her assistant 2 full weeks to finalize because 3 of the guests actively refused to be seated within visible distance of one another, and 2 others had dietary restrictions so complicated they required their own dedicated kitchen station. She had approved everything. That was the thing about Arya. She approved everything. Not because she didn't trust the people around her, but because she'd spent the last 8 years building Sterling Industries from a 2-person logistics startup in a Wicker Park basement into a transportation conglomerate with operations across 14 states. And somewhere along the way, she'd learned that the details were exactly where things went wrong when you stopped paying attention. She was 30 years old. She didn't sleep enough. She drank too much coffee and not enough water, and her assistant kept a standing note in the calendar to remind her to eat lunch, which she ignored about 60% of the time. Her hair was dark and cut sharp at her jaw, the kind of cut that looked effortless and took 40 minutes to maintain. She owned a lot of black. She had a reputation for being brilliant and difficult, and occasionally both at the same time, which was how people talked about women in her position when they didn't know how else to describe someone who'd earned it without apology. Tonight she was wearing a midnight blue gown that her PR team had selected for the optics. Approachable but authoritative, they'd said, whatever that meant. And she'd replaced her usual stud earrings with something her mother had given her before the stroke. Small pearls that she almost never wore because they felt too close to something she wasn't ready to touch most days. Tonight felt different enough. Tonight was the auction. The ballroom on the 42nd floor had been reconfigured for the event. Normal tables pushed to the outer walls, a central aisle left open for the main attraction. That attraction sat on a raised platform at the far end of the room, draped in a cloth of deep charcoal silk that rippled faintly when anyone walked nearby, like it was breathing. The Cassian Vega. Even under the cloth, people knew what it was. The shape gave it away. The low, predatory silhouette, the rear haunch that flared out just slightly before tightening back toward the bumper, the hood that sloped downward in a long, uninterrupted line. The Cassian Vega was a hypercar that had been produced in a limited run of exactly 12 units, a joint venture between a German engineering firm and an Italian design house that had apparently gotten along well enough to produce one masterpiece before the partnership dissolved in a lawsuit. It had a listed retail value of $4.1 million. 3 of the original 12 had already been destroyed, one in a racing incident in Monaco, one in a fire, and one that was currently at the bottom of Lake Como for reasons that nobody had ever fully explained to the press. That left 9 in existence. Arya owned one of them. She'd bought it 3 years ago, before the run sold out, back when she'd just closed the acquisition of 2 regional freight companies that had tripled Sterling's capacity overnight. It had been an indulgence, and she knew it. A purchase made in the white heat of a good quarter when she'd let herself feel, briefly, like the numbers in her bank account were real rather than just characters on a screen. She'd driven the car twice, both times alone, late at night, out to the empty stretch of I-88 west of the city where you could push it and nobody would bother you. Both times she'd felt something she didn't entirely have a word for. Not happiness exactly, but something adjacent to it, something fast. And now she was going to sell it. The proceeds, all of them, before any foundation overhead, a decision she'd made after some internal debate, were going to the Children's Cardiac Surgery Wing at Lakeview General. The wing had been operating at 60% capacity for 2 years because of a funding gap. 12 kids on the waiting list. Some of them had been waiting since before last Christmas. This wasn't performance. She needed people to understand that, though she also knew there was no way to say it publicly without it sounding like performance, so she didn't say it at all. She just wrote the check. Or rather, she auctioned the car and wrote the check, which amounted to the same thing. The expected hammer price was somewhere between $3.8 million and $4.5 million, depending on who was in the room and how the bidding ran. Arya had received confirmed interest from 4 serious collectors, one of whom had flown in from Dubai specifically for tonight. Everything was in place. She was doing a final walkthrough of the setup at 7:30, 90 minutes before the auction was scheduled to begin, when her phone buzzed. Text from Devon Park, her head of events. "Arya, can you come to the platform, please?" She read the message once, then read it again. Devon never texted from inside the venue. He communicated through headsets like a normal event coordinator. She found him near the Vegas platform, standing next to 2 men she didn't recognize and one she did, Gerald Whitmore, the chief engineer from Cassian Motors' North American division, who had been hired to officially certify the car before the auction. He was the automotive equivalent of a notary. His job was to show up, run diagnostics, sign a document confirming the vehicle was in perfect working condition, and leave. Gerald was not leaving. He was standing with his arms crossed and his mouth in a flat, unhappy line, and the 2 men she didn't recognize were looking at a tablet together with the specific body language of people who had delivered bad news and were now trying to become invisible. "Devon," Arya said. Devon stepped forward. He was 28, organized to the point of rigidity, and the only person on her staff who could tell her something had gone wrong without immediately trying to figure out how to blame it on someone else. It was why she kept him. "There's a problem with the car," he said. "Define problem." "It won't start." She looked past him at the platform. The Vega was still draped. The cloth hadn't moved. From out here in the ballroom, nothing looked different. The guests wouldn't begin arriving for another hour. "It won't start how?" she said. "Battery? Software?" "Gerald," Devon said, stepping back. Gerald Whitmore uncrossed his arms. He was in his late 50s, silver-haired, the kind of man who usually projected quiet competence like a second suit. Right now, he looked like someone who'd been asked to explain the weather. "We ran full diagnostics," Gerald said. "The system is reporting a catastrophic fault in the power distribution network. Specifically, the car's onboard computer is reading a complete failure in the primary power distribution node. It's refusing to initialize the ignition sequence." "Can you reset it?" "We tried that." "Can you override the computer?" The Vega's system doesn't allow for manual override of a fault at that classification level. It's a safety lockout. The computer is designed to prevent the car from starting if it reads a fault at that severity. You can't bypass it without factory access. "You're from the factory." "I'm from North American Certification. The diagnostic system requires factory-level root access from the Stuttgart engineering team, which means..." He paused. "It means we'd need to bring a system engineer in from Germany on a Saturday night. With the time difference, we're looking at Monday morning at the earliest before anyone could..." "Monday morning," Arya repeated. "I'm sorry, Ms. Sterling. I know that's not what, but the auction is in 90 minutes. "Yes." She stood very still for a moment. Around her, the ballroom staff moved through their setups, unaware. Somewhere near the bar, someone was adjusting a floral arrangement that didn't need adjusting. The lights overhead were the specific warm amber of serious money, and they made everything look slightly better than it was. "What are my options?" she said. It wasn't really a question. Gerald looked at the two technicians, then back at her. I can call Stuttgart and explain the situation, see if there's any remote access protocol we can invoke. But I have to be honest with you. I've never seen this particular fault on a Vega before, and our team doesn't have the engineering documentation to troubleshoot it manually tonight. If I start poking around in that system without the right documentation, I could make it worse. So you're telling me, Arya said slowly, that a $4.1 million car won't start, you can't fix it, and the best you can offer me is a phone call to Germany at midnight on a Saturday. Gerald didn't answer, which was, in its own way, an answer. She made a decision in the next 10 seconds, which was longer than she usually took, but shorter than most people would have considered adequate for the situation. Keep the cloth on it, she said. Don't touch anything. Nobody talks about this outside of the four of us until I figure out what we're doing. She walked away from the platform and found a quiet corner near the kitchen access door where she could think without being observed. She called her lawyer first, then her insurance broker, then spent 6 minutes staring at the wall calculating what it would cost. In dollars, in reputation, in the look on the face of the man in Dubai who had flown 9 hours for this, to announce tonight that the auction was postponed. The 12 kids on the waiting list. She thought about that last. She was still standing there when the guests began arriving. The Hargroves ballroom had a capacity of 400, and by 8:15 every seat was occupied and there were another 40 people standing near the bar or in the aisles between tables, the way wealthy people stood at events like this, loosely, as if gathered by accident, as if they'd just happened to all end up in the same room and weren't entirely sure how. She recognized faces from finance, from tech, from real estate, from local politics. There was a former senator near the window. There was the CEO of a shipping conglomerate she'd been trying to acquire for 2 years sitting at table 6, which Devin had arranged without being asked because Devin noticed things. She moved through the room for 40 minutes doing what the night required, thanking donors, accepting compliments about the venue, deflecting questions about the car with a smile that she'd spent years calibrating to communicate warmth while giving away nothing. She was good at this. She was very good at this. But she was also running calculations that had nothing to do with small talk. Gerald's team had quietly been at work near the platform, behind the still-draped Vega, while the guests mingled. At 8:45, Gerald appeared at her elbow with an update that he delivered in a near whisper. Stuttgart had responded to his contact. They confirmed that the fault code the diagnostic was showing corresponded to a known but rare anomaly in the Vega's third-generation power management system. But the remote access protocol required 2 factory-credentialed engineers present at the vehicle to authenticate, and they couldn't provide that tonight. Dead end. She thanked him. She straightened her dress. She walked to the center of the room. At 9 o'clock, she stepped to the podium at the front of the ballroom, and the room settled. She was good at room settling. People paid attention to her in the specific way they paid attention to someone who had earned it rather than someone who had simply purchased it, and she knew the difference and was aware of what it had cost her. She talked about the foundation. She talked about the cardiac wing, about the waiting list, about what it meant to have capacity sitting unused in a hospital while children were transferred to out-of-state facilities because the funding wasn't there to run the program. She talked about these things clearly and without sentimentality, because sentimentality was a shortcut, and the people in this room didn't need shortcuts. They needed to understand the math and the mission. Then she introduced the car. 2 of Devin's staff pulled the charcoal silk from the Vega in one practiced motion, and the room reacted the way rooms always reacted to that car. The intake of breath, the immediate lean forward, the low murmur of people who were already rich experiencing the particular feeling of wanting something they couldn't easily have. The Cassian Vega under those amber lights was unreasonably beautiful. Dark midnight paint that shifted toward blue depending on the angle. The lines of it looked like something that had been designed by someone who was angry at everything that had come before. Arya let the room breathe it in for a moment. Then she said, "Before we begin the bidding, I'd like to do something a little unusual for an event like this. I want to start the engine." She nodded to Gerald, who was standing near the rear of the platform. Gerald walked to the driver's side door, opened it, lowered himself into the seat, reached for the ignition. Nothing. He tried again. Nothing. Arya watched from the podium with the expression of someone who had not been surprised and was refusing to allow herself to be rattled, even though her pulse was doing something that she'd prefer it not be doing. She said with complete calm, "We appear to be having a technical difficulty." The murmur in the room changed key. Gerald got out of the car. One of the technicians moved to him with the tablet. They had a brief exchange that was clearly not going well, which Arya could read from 20 feet away because Gerald's shoulders were doing something they hadn't been doing earlier. She stepped away from the podium and walked to the platform. She crouched next to Gerald and the technician, who showed her the tablet screen, and she looked at it knowing that whatever she was looking at was not going to tell her anything she didn't already know. She nodded anyway. When she stood up and turned back to face the room, 400 people were watching her. "Our engineering team is going to need a few minutes," she said. The lie was smooth and practiced, the kind of thing you said when you needed time to think. "In the meantime, it's the PD7 fault." The voice came from somewhere in the middle of the room. Not loud, not performing, just clear, the way someone's voice is clear when they're not trying to be heard by everyone and simply are, because the room had gone quiet enough. Arya stopped. She looked out at the tables, found the voice after a moment. A man standing at table 9, near the middle of the central aisle. He was standing because he'd apparently just pushed his chair back, and he looked like he hadn't entirely decided yet whether standing was a good idea. 30-something. Dark hair that needed cutting. A jacket that fit well enough but had the specific quality of something worn only for occasions like this. The kind of face that had probably been called handsome at some point in its life, and currently just looked tired in the way that people look tired when the tired is structural rather than just tonight. There was a boy sitting next to the empty chair, 8, maybe 9, dark-haired like the man, watching with the wide-eyed attention of a child who was keeping very, very still because he understood that something important was happening even if he didn't know exactly what. "I'm sorry," Arya said. "The PD7 fault," the man said again. He shifted his weight slightly, like he was already regretting this. "That's what your diagnostic is showing, isn't it? Power distribution node 7. The computer reads it as a catastrophic failure, but it's not. It's a false positive. The actual fault is upstream. There's a grounding connector in the sub-harness behind the left firewall panel that's susceptible to micro-corrosion at the junction point. And when it degrades, it creates a resistance differential that the PMS misreads as a full node failure." The room was very quiet. Gerald had turned around from the platform. He was looking at the man at table 9 with an expression that moved through several phases in rapid succession. Surprise, skepticism, and then something that might have been the beginning of recognition. Arya looked at this man for a moment. She looked at the boy beside him. She said, "You're saying you know what's wrong with the car?" "Yes." "And you can fix it?" The man paused. Just a breath. "Give me 90 seconds. Somewhere near the back of the room, someone laughed. It was the kind of laugh that spreads. Not cruel exactly, but the laugh of people who are skeptical and slightly relieved to have something to be skeptical about, because the alternative was to keep sitting with the uncomfortable feeling that the evening was collapsing. More people joined it. The laughter moved through the room like a small wave, polite and dismissive at the same time. Arya didn't laugh. She was watching the man at table 9, and she was doing the thing she'd learned to do over 8 years of building a company from nothing. The thing where you looked past the surface presentation and tried to read what was actually underneath. This man was not performing. He was not trying to get attention. He looked, if anything, like someone who was mildly annoyed at himself for having spoken at all. "You have 90 seconds, she said. The laughter in the room stopped. His name, she would learn later, was Mason Reed. But she didn't know that yet as she watched him navigate his way out of the row, stopping to say something quiet to the boy, who nodded seriously, the way kids nod when they've been asked to do something specific and have decided to take the responsibility seriously. And then walking toward the platform with the unhurried movement of someone who had somewhere definite to be and was going there. Gerald stepped forward to intercept him. "Sir, these are precision systems." "I know what they are," Mason said. "I wrote the failure analysis report for this fault in 2019. Cassian's North American Engineering Division had it on file. If you're Gerald Whitmore, you might have seen it, actually. Gerald went very still. You're the author of the Reed Report? Gerald said. Most people called it that, yeah. There was a beat of silence between them that Arya couldn't read, something professional, something that had history in it. Then Gerald stepped aside. Mason crouched at the front left wheel well of the Vega. He reached into the interior of the wheel arch, not far, just a specific distance, like he'd done it before, or at least imagined doing it enough times that his hands knew the geometry, and found something. His expression didn't change much, but he shifted his position slightly, reached with his other hand and worked at something that from Arya's angle she couldn't see. The room was completely silent now. 400 people and not a sound except the faint ambient noise of the building itself, and somewhere, distantly, the climate control system. Then Mason stood up. He looked at Gerald. Start it. Gerald looked at Arya. Arya nodded once. Gerald walked around to the driver's side, lowered himself in, his hand found the ignition. The Cassian Vega started. Not stuttered, not attempted. Started. The engine caught and settled into the low, resonant idle that hypercar engines achieve when the engineering is right. A sound that was simultaneously quiet and enormous, like something large breathing very carefully. The instrument cluster lit. The displays initialized. Every system came online in sequence, fast and clean, the way the car's designers had intended. Someone in the room said, "Oh my God," and then immediately seemed embarrassed about it. Arya looked at the stopwatch in Devon's hand. Devon had started it the moment Mason crouched down. The read on the face was 1:28, 88 seconds. The room came apart. Not in chaos, in the specific pressurized release of 400 people who had been holding their breath simultaneously. Applause starting in patches and then becoming general. A standing ovation developing in the back third of the room and spreading forward. The man from Dubai was on his feet. The former senator was clapping. The CEO of the shipping conglomerate that Arya had been trying to acquire for 2 years was looking at the platform with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. Arya stood at the edge of the platform and watched all of it. She watched Mason Reed accept the applause with the specific awkwardness of someone who had not planned for this, his hands at his sides, his shoulders slightly forward, the posture of a person receiving something they weren't entirely sure they deserved or wanted. The boy at table 9 was standing on his chair, both hands in the air. That was the image that stayed with her. The boy on the chair, arms up, no reservations, no performance, just completely and entirely certain of his father in a way that had nothing to do with the room or the applause or any of the rest of it. She let the room settle. She returned to the podium. She did not try to manufacture a speech about what had just happened, because anything she said would be less than the thing itself, and she knew it. She said, "I believe the auction can proceed," and that was enough. And the room laughed in the relieved way of people who needed to laugh. The bidding opened at $2.8 million, which was conservative, deliberately so. Devon had suggested it, and she'd agreed. Start low, let the energy carry it. The energy was there. Whoever had been in that ballroom in the minutes before was different from whoever was there now, and the difference was that the car was no longer just an object with a price tag. It had a story. It had just acquired one in the span of 88 seconds, and that story was sitting in the middle of the room in the shape of a man who still had some grease under his thumbnail that he hadn't managed to get out before the gala, and a boy who had climbed down from his chair and was now eating something from a small plate with the focused concentration of someone who had just watched his dad do the most important thing in the world and was now ready for dessert. The bidding ran for 17 minutes. It ended at $4.6 million. The man from Dubai got the car. The final number put the foundation's cardiac wing fully funded, with enough remaining to cover the first 18 months of operational costs. Arya shook hands. She smiled. She accepted congratulations and deflected compliments, and did all of the things that the evening required her to do, and she did all of them competently and mostly on autopilot because some part of her brain had already moved on to the next thing, which was the question of who exactly Mason Reed was and how in the specific hell a man like that had ended up at table 9 at her gala with a child in a jacket that had seen better days and knowledge in his hands that her entire certified engineering team had not had. It was a question she intended to answer. But first she had 400 guests, a successfully auctioned hypercar, and a cardiac wing to fund. She straightened her dress. She touched the pearls at her ears. She walked back into the room. It was close to 10:30 when she finally found a gap in the evening, a small pocket of quiet near the far end of the bar where the main cluster of guests hadn't yet migrated, and looked for him. He was at table 9, but the boy was asleep. She almost stopped walking when she saw it. The boy had apparently run out of the specific kind of energy that children deploy at important events. Intense and focused, and then suddenly, completely gone, and had curled into the adjacent chair with his head on his father's folded jacket and one hand tucked under his cheek. Mason Reed sat beside him with his arm along the back of the child's chair, not touching him, just there, and he was watching the room with the quiet attention of someone who had learned to observe rather than participate. He noticed her approaching and made a small motion like he might stand. "Don't," she said. "Don't wake him." Mason settled back. She pulled the empty chair from the opposite side of the table and sat down, which meant she was looking at the sleeping boy from across the table, his dark hair loose over his face, his breathing slow and even. "He fought it for a while," Mason said quietly. "He told me he was fine 3 times. He was definitely not fine." "What's his name?" "Noah." "How old?" 8. Almost 9. Mason looked at the boy with the specific expression that she'd noticed on parents, the one that was exhausted and proud and helpless all at the same time, the one that didn't really have a name. "He made me promise he could come tonight. He heard me talking about the car on the phone and he looked up the Vega on YouTube and then gave me a whole presentation about why he should be there." A pause. "It was genuinely a good presentation. He had a slide." She almost smiled. "He made a slide." "He made a slide." There was a moment of quiet between them. Around the room, the gala was winding toward its end. The particular loosening of a formal event after the main event had concluded, conversations getting longer and less purposeful, people drifting toward exits, staff beginning the slow preliminary work of breakdown. "I need to ask you something," Arya said. "Okay." "The fault you fixed tonight. You said you wrote a report about it, in 2019. Mason's expression didn't change exactly. Something shifted behind it. "Yeah." "Who were you writing it for?" He looked at her for a moment. "Cassian, North America. I was a senior systems engineer in their R&D division. We were doing failure mode analysis on the 3rd-gen PMS, the power management system. I found the grounding fault in simulation. Ran it through about 60 iterations. Wrote the full report, documented the failure sequence, identified 3 potential fixes, sent it up the chain." "What happened to it?" He was quiet for a second. "They sat on it. The launch timeline was already set, and there were production cost implications to changing the connector spec. My supervisor told me the fault was theoretical, that the probability was low enough to be acceptable within their tolerance margins." He looked down at the table briefly. "I disagreed. I pushed. That didn't go over well. You lost your job over it." It wasn't a question. He looked at her. "Eventually, yeah. Not immediately. It was a gradual thing. The way those things go, you get pushed to the side. Your proposals don't get greenlit. Your quarterly reviews get more critical. By the time they actually let me go, it had been 2 years of—" He stopped. Shrugged. Anyway, she repeated. "Noah's mom left about 6 months before I got fired," he said. Not with self-pity, just offering context the way someone hands you a piece of a larger picture when they think you need it to make sense of the rest. "So the timing was what it was. I had a 2-year-old and no job, and a failure analysis report that no one wanted to publish, and I had to figure something out. You opened a repair shop." "I opened a repair shop." Something in his voice that wasn't quite humor, but was in the same neighborhood. "Not hypercar work, obviously. Just cars, regular cars. Brakes and oil changes and the occasional transmission. It's in Pilsen." He said it without apology, which she noted. "It's a good neighborhood, good people. They need someone they can trust." "Do they trust you?" "Most of them." A small pause. "I'm working on the rest." Noah shifted in his sleep, made a small sound, and was still again. Mason's hand moved automatically toward him and then stopped just short of touching him, hovering there for a moment before settling back on the chair arm. Arya watched that. She filed it away somewhere. "The report," she said. "Do you still have it?" "Yeah." "Where?" "My laptop. At home." He looked at her steadily. "I've had it for 6 years. The format's dated, but the findings are still valid. Obviously." He said that last word without smugness, which took some doing given the evening. She nodded slowly. "I'd like to see it." He studied her for a moment. "Why?" It was a fair question. She gave it a fair answer. "Because I spent the last 3 hours of my life watching certified factory engineers from a major automotive brand fail to do what you did in 88 seconds with no tools and no documentation, and I make it my business to understand why things like that happen." Mason was quiet for a moment. He looked at Noah. He looked back at her. "It's a good report," he said finally. "I believe you," she said. And the thing was, she did. She left him there at table 9 with his sleeping son and his folded jacket and 6 years of buried work sitting somewhere on a laptop in Pilsen, and walked back into what remained of the evening. The gala broke up slowly, the way evenings like this always did. The guests departing in the measured flow of people who had come because it mattered, and were leaving because the evening was complete. Devon checked off things on his tablet. Staff dismantled arrangements. The Vega sat on its platform, started once, stopped again, waiting for the man from Dubai to arrange transport, which was a problem for Monday, but a good problem. Arya stood at the window at the end of the evening, 42 floors above Chicago, and watched the lights. 8 years she'd spent building something. 8 years of decisions and calculations and the accumulation of judgment, and tonight she'd watched a man in a jacket from a wedding 2 years ago walk up to a $4 million car that a credentialed team couldn't fix and do it in 88 seconds flat. That wasn't luck. That wasn't a trick. That was what it looked like when someone actually knew something, really knew it, the way you knew something after years of it, after it had cost you something. She had a lot of people around her, smart people, credentialed people, people with the right titles and the right educations and the right institutional affiliations. She stood at the window and asked herself honestly, how many of them actually knew something the way Mason Reed knew cars? She didn't finish the thought, but she kept it. It was the kind of thing worth keeping. The ride back to Pilsen took 40 minutes. Mason had carried Noah out of the Hargrove Grand at 11:15, the boy's head heavy on his shoulder and one shoe half off, and had navigated through the lobby with the practiced one-armed efficiency of someone who had done this particular maneuver many times across many situations. Grocery stores, Little League games that ran long, a birthday party at a laser tag place in Bridgeport that Noah had insisted he wasn't tired at, right up until he was unconscious in the back seat of the truck at 8:45 in the evening. The truck was a 2009 Ford F-150 with 187,000 miles on it, and a check engine light that Mason had diagnosed and chosen to tolerate because the fault was minor and the repair was a cost he'd rather put somewhere else. The heat worked. The radio worked. The driver's side window had a tendency to stick in cold weather, which was most of the year in Chicago, but he'd learned to manage it. He got Noah buckled without waking him. The boy stirred once, said something that might have been a question and might have been nothing, and went back under. Mason drove home through the city with the radio off. He thought about Arya Sterling the whole way, not the way a man thinks about a woman, not exactly, or not only. He thought about her the way he thought about problems that didn't have obvious solutions, the way he turned things over in his head looking for the load-bearing piece, the thing that held the structure up. She had sat across from him at that table with Noah sleeping between them and asked him questions that were precise and not decorative, and she'd listened to the answers with the specific kind of attention that meant she was already 3 moves ahead of whatever he was telling her. He knew that kind of intelligence. He'd worked with it, worked for it, occasionally been frustrated by it when it moved faster than the situation warranted. What he hadn't expected was to find it aimed at him, turned toward him like that. He pulled into the alley behind the shop at 11:50. Parked. Sat for a moment. The shop occupied the street-level floor of a narrow 2-story building on a block that was half commercial, half residential, the kind of block that was either on its way up or had already peaked and was leveling off. and he'd never been entirely sure which. The unit above the shop was where they lived. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that was too small, a living room where Noah's stuff had gradually colonized every available horizontal surface over the past 3 years. Mason paid $1,650 a month for it. It had taken him 4 months to find a landlord who would rent above a working garage to a single father with a kid and a reference list that included a former employer who'd given him the kind of lukewarm non-answer that might as well have been a door closing in his face. He carried Noah upstairs, got the shoes off, got him into bed without brushing his teeth, which he knew he'd hear about tomorrow from the morning version of Noah, who had strong opinions about hygiene and applied them with the selective righteousness of an 8-year-old who was still working out which rules were negotiable. He stood in the doorway of Noah's room for a moment. The room was small. A bed, a desk, shelves full of books and model cars, and the specific chaos of a child who was interested in too many things simultaneously to keep any of them organized. There was a hand-drawn poster on the wall above the desk that said, "Cars are engineered, not built," in thick marker, which Noah had made last winter after Mason had explained to him the difference, and which Mason had told him was good but could be more specific, and which Noah had declined to revise. He pulled the door halfway closed and went to the kitchen. He made coffee he probably shouldn't drink at midnight and stood at the counter with it for a while, still in his dress shirt, with the top button open and the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and thought about the evening in the specific way he'd trained himself to process things, sequentially, without embellishment, facts before interpretation. The car had failed the way he'd predicted it would fail. 6 years ago, he'd run 63 simulations on the 3rd-generation PMS and documented the failure mode in enough detail that someone with basic systems knowledge could have found the fault in a manual search. He'd built in 3 separate repair protocols, ordered by complexity, any of which could have been executed in under 3 minutes. The simplest one, the grounding connector reset, he'd clocked at under 90 seconds in simulation, 88 seconds in practice. He'd been close. The part that he hadn't entirely processed yet, standing in his kitchen at midnight, was the room. The way the room had gone quiet. The way 400 people had watched him walk toward that car and not a single one of them, not the man from Dubai, not the former senator, not Arya Sterling herself, had known whether to believe him or not. That wasn't vanity. He wasn't built for vanity. But there was something in it that he'd needed, maybe, without knowing he needed it, and he wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. His phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown number, Chicago area code. He looked at it for a moment, then picked up. "Mr. Reed." Arya Sterling's voice, unmistakable, that particular cadence, direct and without preamble. "I hope I'm not calling too late." "It's midnight." "It is. I'm still at the venue. I have a question and I didn't want to wait until Monday to ask it." He leaned against the counter. "Okay. The report you wrote. The failure analysis. Who else has seen it, outside of Cassian's engineering division?" He hadn't expected that question. He'd expected something more transactional. A thank you, a polite inquiry about his shop, maybe an offer of something that would sound generous and end up being nothing. He took a second to recalibrate. "My old thesis advisor saw a draft. A colleague at Cassian named Brennan Torres. He was on the original PMS team with me. He reviewed the methodology before I submitted it internally. After I was let go, I sent a version to 2 trade publications, engineering journals." He paused. "Both passed on it." "Why?" "The first one said the fault rate was too low to be publication-worthy from a safety standpoint, that without documented real-world cases, it read as theoretical. The second one," he stopped. "The second one had a consulting relationship with Cassian at the time. I found that out after." A brief silence. "How long were you at Cassian?" 7 years. Joined right out of grad school." "And you enjoyed it?" It wasn't a question exactly, but it wasn't not one. "Yeah," he said. "I did. For the most part." He looked at the coffee pot. "It's harder to be in a place you love when the place stops working the way you thought it worked. You have to recalibrate a lot of things at once." "What kind of things?" "What you're worth. Who decides that? Whether your judgment is actually good or whether you've just been telling yourself it is." He paused. "The usual." "That doesn't sound usual." No, he admitted. It's not. He could hear faint sound in the background on her end, the distant movement of an event being dismantled, chairs scraping, something being wheeled across a floor. She was still there. He could picture her in that ballroom, reduced now to its bones, the amber lights probably dimmed for the breakdown crew. I'm going to be direct with you, she said. I'd prefer it. Sterling Industries has a transportation division, freight, commercial fleet management, some specialty vehicle acquisition and resale. We've been expanding into high-end vehicle consulting over the last 18 months. I have people who are good at numbers and good at logistics and good at the business end of things. She paused briefly. I don't have anyone who knows what you know, not the way you know it. He was quiet for a moment. That's a job offer, he said. It's the beginning of one. The specifics would take longer than a midnight phone call. He looked around his kitchen, the coffee pot, the magnet on the fridge that said Dad's Diner in Noah's handwriting from 3 years ago when he'd gone through a phase of labeling everything, the stack of invoices on the counter that he needed to go through by Thursday, maintenance parts for 3 different commercial accounts, a supplier who'd raised his pricing 12% and hadn't mentioned it until the invoice came through. I appreciate what you're offering, he said. I do. But I need you to understand something first. Go ahead. I've been down this road before. Not the same road, but similar enough. A company that needs something from me, and when I've given it, the situation changes. The terms shift. What they said they wanted turns out not to be exactly what they wanted, and what I thought I was agreeing to turns out not to be what I agreed to. He said it without anger, just fact. So before we talk specifics, I need to know what you actually want from me. Not the polished version, the actual version. The silence on her end was longer this time. He waited it out. Honest answer? She said finally. Yeah. I want to understand how a man who wrote a report that predicted a failure mode in a $4 million car, a report that was correct and thorough and apparently suppressed, ends up running a repair shop in Pilsen 6 years later. Because that shouldn't have happened. And the fact that it did tells me something about how the industry works that I need to understand better than I currently do. And she stopped, started again, slightly differently. And I watched you fix that car tonight, and I watched your son watch you fix it, and I think there's something in what you know that I've been missing in the people around me. And I tend to take that kind of thing seriously when I notice it. He exhaled slowly. That's a more honest answer than I expected, he said. I find it's usually faster. Okay. He turned and set his coffee mug in the sink. Send me something in writing about the role, what it actually involves, what it pays, what the expectations are. I'll read it. I'll have it to you by Tuesday. And one more thing. Yes. The report. If I come on board in any capacity, the report gets published, under my name, with the original methodology intact, not as a corporate document, not as a Sterling Industries white paper, as my work, credited to me. The pause before she answered was short. Agreed? Just like that? Just like that, she said. It should have been published 6 years ago. I don't see a reason to delay it further. He nodded to himself in the empty kitchen, which was a thing he did when something surprised him in a good way, but he didn't want to say so out loud. Tuesday, he said. Tuesday, she confirmed. Good night, Mr. Reed. Good night. He set the phone down on the counter, stood there for a moment. Then he turned off the kitchen light and stood in the dark for a bit, not thinking about anything in particular, just letting the evening settle into whatever shape it was going to settle into. Outside, Chicago was still going. It always was, past midnight, the city's particular insistence on continuing. And the faint sound of it came through the walls of the building the way it always did, ambient and indifferent, and somehow, on nights like this, oddly comforting. Noah was up at 7:14, which Mason knew because 7:14 was when he heard the creak of the third floorboard from the left in the hallway, which Noah had never once successfully avoided in 3 years of trying. I'm awake, Mason said from his bed. I know, Noah said from the hallway. I was being quiet. You were quiet until the third board. A pause. I keep forgetting that one. Step over it, not around it, over. Noah appeared in the doorway. He was still in his dress shirt from the gala, which he'd apparently slept in, and his hair was doing something complicated on one side. He was holding the small lapel pin that he'd worn on his jacket the night before, a tiny silver gear, something he'd found at a flea market and decided was essential, and turning it between his fingers the way he did when he was thinking. "Dad," he said. "Yeah. Last night was real, right? It actually happened." "What part?" "All of it." He came into the room and sat on the edge of the bed in the way that he'd been doing since he was 4, when the sitting had required a small running jump and now just required a step up. "You fixing the car, and all those people watching, and that lady who sat with us, the one whose car it was." "Arya Sterling. Her." Noah turned the gear pin over. "She looked at you like you were—" He stopped, searching for the word. "Like you were the most important person in the room. I noticed that." Mason looked at the ceiling. "You notice a lot of things." "You always say I should. I know. Was she nice?" "She was." He considered this. "She was direct, which is better than nice, usually." Noah thought about that. "Is she going to call you again?" "She already did, last night, after you were asleep." Noah straightened up. "And?" "And she wants to talk about a job, working with her company." The silence that followed had several layers in it. Mason waited. "What about the shop?" Noah said finally. "The shop stays. Nothing's been decided. We just talked." "But you're thinking about it." "I'm thinking about it." Noah was quiet for another moment, then, "Would it be better? Like, would we have more money?" The question landed the way those questions always landed from Noah, direct and without apology, because he'd never learned to be embarrassed by practical concerns the way adults did, not yet. He'd grown up understanding that money was a real thing in the way kids who'd grown up without enough of it understood, not as an abstraction, not as something that arrived automatically. He knew what the invoices on the kitchen counter meant. He knew what it meant when Mason said they'd do the thing after the next good month. "Maybe," Mason said, "if the terms are right." "Then you should do it." "It's not that simple, bud." "Why not? You're smart. You know more than those guys last night, and they have the fancy job." Mason sat up. "It's not just about being smart. It's about—" He stopped, trying to find the version of this that wasn't just noise. "It's about making sure that if I walk into something, I walk in knowing exactly what it is, not what it looks like, what it actually is." Noah looked at him steadily. He had his mother's eyes, that same particular gray that shifted in certain light, and he deployed them with a directness that still occasionally caught Mason off guard, even now. "That's because of the last time," Noah said. Mason said nothing. "It's okay," Noah said. "I'm just saying, I know. I know you know. And I think this is different." He set the gear pin down on the nightstand. "She sat with us. She didn't have to do that. She just did it." Mason looked at his son for a moment. 8 years old, dress shirt from yesterday, complicated hair, and the absolute unearned certainty of someone who had decided something was true and wasn't interested in being argued out of it. "Go brush your teeth," Mason said. Noah slid off the bed. At the door he stopped and turned. "For the record," he said, "I think you were the smartest person in that room last night." "You're biased." "Yeah," Noah agreed, "but I'm also right." He disappeared down the hallway. Mason heard the bathroom door, heard the water run, heard the third floorboard creak on the way back, and then a small sound of frustration. Step over, not around. He'd get it eventually. The shop opened at 9 on Sundays, half days, and Mason was there by 8:45 with coffee from the place on the corner that had been there since before he'd moved in and employed approximately the same 3 people it had always employed, and made coffee that was not special in any describable way but was reliably exactly what it was supposed to be, which was its own kind of quality. The current jobs in the Bay were 3: a 2017 Civic with a brake line issue that was straightforward, a commercial van from a local bakery operation whose transmission was throwing codes in a pattern that Mason had narrowed to the torque converter but hadn't yet confirmed, and a 1998 Camry belonging to a woman named Esperanza Ruiz, who lived 2 blocks over and who brought her car to him every 6 months for maintenance with the same checklist written on a folded piece of paper that she pulled from her purse each time and handed to him like a document of state. He had 2 part-time mechanics, one named Darius, 24, who was good with his hands and learning fast and had a bad habit of making assumptions instead of checking, which Mason had been correcting methodically since he hired him, and one named Priya, 27, who had left an engineering program partway through and hadn't yet figured out that the engineering background was a significant advantage rather than a detour, which Mason also hadn't mentioned yet because he thought she'd get there on her own and it would mean more to her when she did. Neither of them was in on Sundays. It was just Mason. He worked the Civic's brake line in the morning quiet, the radio on low. Talk radio, not music. He liked the sound of voices while he worked, and let his mind do the thing it did when his hands were occupied, which was process things sideways, not directly. He thought about the conversation with Arya Sterling. He thought about the offer, or the shape of the offer, which was all it was right now. He thought about what it would mean to walk into a corporation again, even a different one, even with different terms. He thought about Cassian. He'd spent 7 years there and believed in the work in the specific way that engineers believed in things they could document and prove. And then the thing he'd documented and proven had been set aside and he'd been shown, gradually and then all at once, that what he believed in and what the company believed in were not the same thing and had never been. That wasn't bitterness. He'd put the bitterness down a long time ago because he couldn't afford it. Not with Noah, not with the shop, not with anything. You couldn't carry something that heavy and still carry the things that actually mattered. But he hadn't forgotten what it felt like. And last night, in 88 seconds, in front of 400 people and one sleeping child, he'd fixed a fault that his former employer had suppressed a report about, and the car had started and the room had gone quiet. He wiped his hands on the shop rag, looked at the finished brake line. Clean work. He confirmed it, double-checked it the way he always did, then set the rag down and went to make a note in the job log. His phone was on the workbench. While he'd been under the Civic, 2 things had come in. A text from his old thesis advisor, Dr. Patricia Lund, that said simply, "Mason, I just saw a video. Was that you?" With a link to a clip that someone had apparently posted from the gala the night before, and an email notification from an address he didn't recognize, subject line blank, which he'd look at later. He opened the video link. It was 43 seconds long. Shaky phone footage from somewhere in the back third of the ballroom, the angle catching his approach to the car. And then, shakier, moved to get a better view. The crouched work, the stand, the instruction to start it, the engine catching. The clip cut there. No caption, just the video. Already 11,000 views. He set the phone face down on the workbench. 11,000. He stood there for a moment with his hands on the workbench surface, looking at nothing in particular, and felt something that was not entirely comfortable. Recognition was a strange thing. He hadn't wanted it for the reason people usually wanted it. He'd stepped forward last night because the problem was there, and he knew the answer, and not stepping forward had felt, in the moment, like a choice he couldn't make in front of his son. That was the whole of it. And now 11,000 people had watched 43 seconds of it, and more would, probably, because that was how these things moved. He'd have to tell Darius and Priya before they saw it themselves. He picked up the phone and called Dr. Lund. She picked up on the second ring, which for a Sunday morning meant she'd been waiting for him to call. "I knew it was you," she said before he could say anything. "I recognized the posture. You always crouched exactly like that, even in the lab. Weight on the right knee. I told the video to my colleague 3 times. Patricia took up, don't Patricia me in that tone. Tell me everything. Start with why you were at a Sterling Foundation gala in the first place." He leaned against the workbench. Outside, a delivery truck went past, its engine cycling through a sequence that sounded like it needed attention, but would probably hold for another month. He knew the sound of things that would hold versus things that wouldn't. It was most of what he knew. "Noah wanted to see the car," he said. "That child." He made a presentation. "He is your son," she said, with the tone of someone who found this both logical and slightly exasperating. "What happened after?" "I couldn't tell from the video. It cuts off." He told her. "Not everything, but the relevant shape of it. The room, the auction result, the conversation at table 9, the phone call at midnight. He told it flat, without inflection, the way he told her most things, because she'd been his thesis advisor for 3 years and his informal professional sounding board for 6 more, and she'd never required inflection from him. She'd always been able to hear what he meant under the way he said it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, she agreed to publish the report? Agreed immediately. Which was her version of a longer response. And you believe her? I believe she means it right now. Whether that holds, yes, the usual concerns. He could hear her setting something down on a surface. Cup, probably. She was always holding a cup. Mason, I want to say something to you, and I want you to actually hear it. Okay? You have spent 6 years being right about something that no one would let you be right about. That is a specific kind of damage that people don't talk about enough. And last night, in front of 400 people, and your son, you were right in a way that couldn't be buried or minimized or assigned to someone else. That matters. Not for the career piece. I know you know how to make a case for yourself professionally. I mean, it matters for you, as a person. She paused. I just want you to let it matter, without immediately moving on to the next thing to worry about. He didn't say anything for a moment. I'm not great at that, he said finally. I know, I'm noting it anyway. Noted. Good. Her voice returned to its usual pitch. Now, about the Sterling offer. I want to see the terms before you sign anything, and the report publication needs to be contractually stipulated, not just verbally promised. You know that. I know that. Send me whatever she sends you. Patricia, you're retired. I'm consulting. It's different. He almost smiled. I'll send it. He hung up. Stood in the quiet of the shop with the radio going low in the background, the smell of oil and metal, and the particular cold of a Chicago November seeping under the bay door, the 3 jobs waiting in the bays, the 700 square feet of space that had been his entire professional life for the past 4 years, and thought about what it meant to leave a thing you'd built, even to build something bigger. He didn't have an answer yet. He wasn't sure the question was fully formed, but Tuesday was 2 days away, and he'd read what she sent him, and he'd make a decision the way he always made decisions, by taking the thing apart first and looking at what it was actually made of, not just what it looked like from outside. He picked up the shop rag, went back to work. The email from Arya arrived Tuesday morning at 7:52, which was either early for a CEO or exactly on time for someone who'd said Tuesday and meant it. Mason read it at the shop, standing at the workbench with his second coffee of the morning, still in his jacket because the heat in the bay took 40 minutes to properly circulate in November. The email was 3 paragraphs and an attachment. The paragraphs were direct: role description, general scope, compensation range that made him set the coffee down. And the attachment was a 4-page document that was clearly a first draft of a consulting agreement, not a final offer, but thorough enough that someone had put real time into it over the weekend. He read the 4 pages twice. Then he forwarded it to Dr. Lund. She called him 11 minutes later. The publication clause is in Section 3, she said without preamble. It's there, but it's soft. Sterling Industries will endeavor to facilitate publication. Endeavor. That word is doing a lot of work. I noticed. It needs to be will publish or will support publication with full authorship credit by a specific date. Give them 90 days from contract signing. That's reasonable, and it closes the door on indefinite delay. Anything else? The intellectual property section, paragraph 4, subpoint B. Anything you develop in the scope of the consulting role is theirs. You need a carve-out for work that predates the agreement. The Reed report and anything derived from it stays yours. He'd flagged the same paragraph. Agreed. And the rate, she said. Take it. I haven't told you what it is. Whatever it is, take it. You've been undercharging this city for 4 years. He almost said something about that, then didn't. I'll send her the red lines today. Good. And Mason, she paused in that way she had, the brief stop before the thing she actually wanted to say. Be careful not to negotiate yourself out of this because it's easier than the alternative. He didn't answer right away. That's not what I'm doing, he said. I didn't say it was. I said, be careful that it isn't. She hung up. He stood with the phone for a moment, then set it on the bench and went back to the transmission job on the bakery van, which had confirmed itself as a torque converter issue overnight and now just needed the work done. He sent the red line document to Arya at noon. Her response came back at 2:15. All 3 changes accepted. Can we meet Thursday to discuss scope in more detail? I can come to you if that's easier. He read that last sentence twice. I can come to you. He'd half expected the meeting to be in some Sterling Industries conference room on the 45th floor of something, the kind of environment that was designed to establish context before a word was spoken. The offer to come to Pilsen was either genuine or strategic, and he wasn't sure yet which, but he wrote back and gave her the address of the shop. She showed up Thursday at 11 in a black car that was not ostentatious, a late model sedan, plain, the kind that suggested the person inside it didn't need to announce anything. She was in dark slacks and a gray jacket, no gown, no event armor, and she stood outside the bay door for a second looking at the shop front with an expression that was reading, assessing, doing whatever she did with information when she first encountered it. Darius was in the far bay working the Civic's follow-up alignment. He'd seen the video by Monday morning, which Mason had expected, and had spent approximately 4 minutes being visibly awed by it before Mason had redirected him back to the alignment rack. Priya had been more contained about it, which meant she'd processed it privately and was still processing it, which was how Priya did things. Both of them looked up when Arya came in. Mason wiped his hands and met her at the door. They shook hands. Brief, practical. You actually work here, she said. Not judgmental, just noting. Most days. She looked around the bay. Her eyes moved the way competent people's eyes moved in unfamiliar spaces. Not decoratively, but cataloging. She looked at the rack, at the job board on the wall, at the tools organized along the left wall with the specific system that Mason had developed over 4 years, and which Darius still occasionally violated, and then corrected when Mason said nothing about it because the silence was worse than being told directly. How long have you had it? She asked. The shop? 4 years in February? You built the client base yourself. Had to. I came in with no contacts in this neighborhood. First 6 months were tight. How tight? He considered the question. Most people who asked that were asking performatively, wanting the story of difficulty without the actual information. She was asking like she wanted the number. Tight enough that Noah and I ate a lot of eggs, he said, and I pulled from savings I couldn't really afford to pull from. But I'd done the math before I opened, and I knew what the break-even looked like, so it wasn't a surprise. It was just uncomfortable. She nodded. Where do you want to do this? He'd set up 2 chairs and a cleared section of the workbench at the back of the shop, away from the active bays. Not an office, he didn't have one, but a space that was functional and didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. They sat. She had a tablet with her. He had a notepad because he thought better when he wrote things by hand, and he'd stopped apologizing for it. I want to tell you what I'm actually trying to build, she said. And then I want to know whether the role I've described makes sense for it, or whether I've got it wrong. He hadn't expected that either. Go ahead. Sterling's transportation division manages about 200 commercial fleet vehicles directly and has consulting arrangements with 4 regional freight operators who collectively run another 600. The fleet management side is fine. It runs. But the consulting work is where I think we're losing. She set the tablet down on the bench. We have 3 consultants right now. 2 came from logistics backgrounds, 1 from fleet insurance. They're good at the operational side, route efficiency, cost analysis, compliance. None of them can look at a vehicle and tell me what's actually wrong with it versus what a diagnostic is reporting might be wrong with it. Those are different things, Mason said. I'm learning that. She said it with the particular tone of someone who didn't like learning things from ignorance, but accepted it as the starting condition when it was true. 3 months ago, one of our freight clients had a fleet vehicle fail a state inspection for an emissions fault. The fault code pointed to a catalytic converter issue. They replaced the catalytic converter. It failed again 6 weeks later. Same code. Different vehicle, same fault pattern. She looked at him. What does that tell you? He didn't hesitate. It tells you the converter wasn't the problem. The code is accurate about what's failing, not about why. If you're seeing the same fault pattern across multiple vehicles, you're looking upstream, probably a fuel trim issue. Possibly an oxygen sensor that's giving a false reading and causing the system to run rich, which is then damaging converters as a downstream effect. Fix the root cause. The converter stops failing. Arya was quiet for a moment. Our consultant told them to replace the converters. Your consultant was reading the code, not the system. How long would it have taken you to figure out what I just told you? If I could look at the vehicle, 45 minutes, maybe less. She wrote something on the tablet. He noticed she was taking notes, which told him this was a working meeting, not a performance of one. He adjusted slightly. The role I described, she said, I think it's too narrow. I put you in a technical advisory capacity because that's where I could see the application most clearly, but I think I underthought it. She looked at him directly. What would you do with access to our fleet operations and our consulting client base if I gave you actual authority instead of just advisory access? It was a bigger question than he'd prepared for. He looked at the notepad, thought for a moment. First 6 weeks, I'd audit, he said. Not the financials, your people can do that. I'd audit the maintenance records for every vehicle you directly manage. Look for patterns in the fault histories. I'd bet money there are at least 2 systemic issues in that fleet that are being addressed symptomatically instead of at the root, and you're paying for the same repairs cycling on a predictable schedule without anyone catching it. And after the audit, I'd build a diagnostic protocol for your consulting clients, a framework for evaluating vehicle issues that goes beyond the OBD codes, incorporates the vehicle history, the operating conditions, the maintenance intervals, something your consultants can actually use that catches the difference between what a system reports and what's actually failing. He paused. And I'd train your people to use it, not just hand them a document, actually train them. Arya was looking at him with the same expression she'd had the night of the gala, at table 9, that quality of attention that felt like being read accurately, which was unsettling in a way he didn't entirely mind. That's bigger than what I offered you, she said. You asked what I'd do with the access. I know. She looked at the tablet. It's also more useful than what I offered you, which is on me for not thinking it through properly. She set the tablet down. I'm going to be honest with you about something. You said you prefer that. I do, which is why. She stopped, straightened slightly, the way people straightened when they were about to say something they'd decided to say, even though it wasn't comfortable. I came here partly because of what you said at the gala. In the 90 seconds, I mean. Not what you said, what you did. But also partly because of what you said to me afterward, about walking into something and knowing what it actually is. Okay. I've built Sterling on a set of assumptions about how to evaluate people. Credentials, institutions, track records, and visible roles. It's worked mostly. My team is good. But I've been in rooms in the last 2 years where the smartest person there was operating below the level they should have been, and I didn't see it until something failed. She looked at him. I don't want to be the person who keeps not seeing it. He turned his pen over in his hands. It was a thing he did. He knew when he was deciding how much to say. That's harder than it sounds, he said. I know. Because the systems you've built, the credential filters, the institutional markers, they work well enough that it's difficult to justify changing them, even when they're wrong. The cost of being wrong with a good-looking credential is invisible until the car doesn't start. The cost of hiring someone without them is visible immediately and easy to criticize. He looked at her. You'll face that from inside your own organization if you bring me in. People who will look at my resume and see a repair shop in Pilsen and draw a conclusion. I know that too. And you're not concerned. I'm concerned, she said flatly. I just don't care. He almost laughed. Didn't, but almost. Okay, he said. Okay? Okay, let's talk about what an expanded scope actually looks like, and what it pays and what the timeline is. And then I'll tell you yes or no. She pulled the tablet back in front of her. For the next 2 hours, they worked through it. Real numbers, real scope, real questions about what the role required and what the shop required and what Noah's school schedule looked like and whether remote work was an option for certain weeks and what the travel expectations were. It was practical and slightly awkward in the way that real negotiations were when both parties were trying to be honest and kept running into the gaps between what they'd assumed and what was actually true. At one point, Arya said, I assumed you'd want to close the shop. in a tone that suggested she'd been building that assumption into the structure of the offer, and Mason said, "Then we have a problem," with enough flatness that she stopped and looked at him, and he said, "The shop is not a placeholder. It's not something I'm doing until something better comes along. Those are my clients. They're real people who need someone they can trust. I'm not walking away from that." A pause. "Can you run both?" "For the right arrangement, yes. It'll require Darius to step up and Priya to take on more client-facing work, and I'll need to be selective about which Sterling projects I take on in the early months. But yes." She looked at him for a long moment. "Most people don't negotiate with a non-negotiable first," she said. "It's not a negotiation tactic. It's just true." "I know," she said. "That's why it worked." They settled it by 2 in the afternoon. Not the full contract, that would take the lawyers another week, but the shape of it, the actual thing rather than the outline of a thing, and Mason had the specific feeling he'd learned to trust over years of engineering work, the feeling of something load-bearing that was properly seated. Not perfect, but right. Arya left the way she'd arrived, in the plain black sedan, and Mason stood at the bay door for a moment watching it pull out and turn onto the block. Darius materialized from the far bay. He'd been in earshot of about 30% of the conversation, Mason estimated, which was intentional on neither of their parts, but also not surprising. "So," Darius said. "So," Mason said, "you're going to be working for Sterling Industries. Consulting for, part-time initially." Darius looked at the empty street where the car had been, then at Mason. He was 24 and mostly confident, and occasionally said things that were more perceptive than his usual manner suggested, which was a thing Mason valued in him, even when it was inconvenient. "You know what Priya's going to say," Darius said. "What's Priya going to say?" "She's going to say it's about time, except she'll say it like it's obvious, the way she says everything." "She's not wrong," Mason said. "No." Darius went back to his bay, then, over his shoulder, "For what it's worth, Theo, the video's at 140,000 now. I checked this morning." Mason turned. "That's not relevant." "Just saying. Do the alignment check on the van before 3. "Already started." Mason went back to the workbench. He stood there for a moment with his hands on the surface and thought about 140,000 people watching 43 seconds of him doing the thing he knew how to do. He thought about the contract shape, about the audit he'd already started mapping in his head while Arya was still talking, about the oxygen sensor issue in Arya's freight client's fleet that was probably still cycling through expensive downstream repairs while nobody asked the right upstream question. He thought about Noah, who would get home from school at 3:20 and would ask immediately, because Noah always asked immediately. He picked up his pen, opened the notepad to a clean page. He started writing the framework for the audit. Noah did ask immediately. He came through the door from the shop stairwell at 3:22, backpack still on, and said, "Did she come?" before he'd even cleared the door frame. "She came." And we talked. "Dad." Mason looked up from the notepad. "We agreed on terms. I'll be consulting for Sterling part-time starting in January. The shop stays. You're not changing schools." Noah processed this for approximately 1 second. Then, "I knew it. You didn't know anything." "I knew something," Noah corrected. He dropped the backpack and came to look over Mason's shoulder at the notepad, which was covered in what was, to any outside eye, an incomprehensible web of fleet maintenance codes and system cross-references in Mason's personal shorthand. Noah looked at it the way he'd always looked at Mason's notes, like he was trying to decode a language he'd eventually speak fluently. "What's that?" he asked. "Start of an audit framework. For her fleet." "You're already working?" "I'm already thinking." Noah straightened up. He went to the fridge and found the remains of last night's dinner, which he began consuming standing at the counter without plates, which was an argument they had periodically, and which Mason had mostly stopped pushing because there were larger things. "Dad," Noah said with his mouth full. "Don't," he swallowed. "What if they try to bury this one too, like Cassian did?" The question sat in the room. Mason put his pen down. "Then I have a contract that says they can't," he said. "And I have Dr. Lund, who will make their lawyers unhappy if they try. And I'm not 26 this time." What's different about not being 26? When you're 26 and someone buries your work, you argue. Then you get quieter. Then you leave. He looked at his son. When you're 32 and someone tries to bury your work, you've already learned that argument isn't the only tool. Noah thought about that. He was 8, almost 9, and he thought about things the way certain kids did. Not for performance, but because the thinking was actually happening, you could see it on his face. What are the other tools, he asked. Contracts, Mason said. Documentation. People who've agreed in writing to stand behind you. He picked the pen back up. Turns out the boring stuff is the most important stuff. Noah made a face that said he found this both true and disappointing as a revelation. I still think you were the smartest person in that room, he said. You said that already. Still true. He took the leftover container back to the fridge. Can I help with the audit thing? You have homework. After homework. Mason looked at the notepad, at the fleet codes, the system cross-references, the shape of a problem that had been sitting in someone's operation long enough to become expensive and was about to get properly examined for the first time. After homework, he said. Noah grinned and went to get his backpack. Outside, the November cold pressed against the windows of the building, and 2 blocks over the city moved through its late afternoon rhythms. Deliveries, school pickups, the particular sound of a neighborhood that worked for a living. Mason sat at the table with his pen and his notepad, and the beginning of something that was going to require more from him than he'd given anything in a long time. He didn't mind that. He'd been ready to give more for a while. He just hadn't had the right place to put it. The contract was signed on a Thursday in December, 12 days before Christmas, in a conference room on the 38th floor of Sterling Industries' downtown office that had a view of the lake that Mason spent approximately 4 seconds appreciating before turning back to the document. Dr. Lund had reviewed the final version twice and made 2 additional changes that the Sterling legal team accepted without significant pushback, which she told Mason afterward meant either they were reasonable requests or Sterling's lawyers were tired, and she suspected both. The publication clause now read, Sterling Industries will support and facilitate the publication of the Reed Report in its original form, with full authorship credit to Mason T. Reed, within 90 days of the execution of this agreement. Specific, dated, closed. Mason signed it with the pen he'd had since grad school, which was a thing he hadn't planned and didn't comment on. Aria signed across from him. She had 3 people with her, her general counsel, Devin, and a woman named Claire Sato, who ran the transportation division and who had been watching Mason since he walked in with the particular expression of someone who was withholding judgment pending evidence. He'd noticed it and didn't mind. Withheld judgment he could work with. It was the judgment that had already arrived and locked the door that caused problems. After the signatures, there was a brief handshake, a few words about start dates, and then Aria said, I'd like you to sit down with Claire before you leave today, if you have time. She can give you access to the fleet records. Mason looked at Claire. Claire looked at Mason with the expression still in place. I have time, he said. He sat with Claire Sato for 2 hours that afternoon in a smaller room down the hall, and by the end of the first hour, the expression had shifted. Not gone. She wasn't the kind of person who let things go entirely on short acquaintance, but modified, the way someone's posture changed when the information coming in didn't match the assumption they'd started with, and they were too honest to pretend otherwise. Claire was 41, had spent 14 years in commercial fleet management, and knew the operational side of what she ran with the thorough competence of someone who had grown up in the work, rather than arrived at it through a business school. What she didn't have was the mechanical depth to distinguish between what a diagnostic system reported and what was actually failing in the vehicle underneath. She knew this about herself, which was its own kind of intelligence, and it was the reason she hadn't argued when Aria told her Mason was coming on board. What she had argued about was the scope. She told me you wanted full audit access from day one, Claire said, in a tone that made clear she hadn't loved that. I need to see the maintenance records going back 3 years before I can tell you where the problems are, Mason said. If I only look at current data, I'm going to miss the patterns. The records are complete, they're just... She stopped. Embarrassing? He said. A pause. Complicated. Same thing sometimes. She almost smiled. Didn't. There are repair cycles in 2 of our direct managed fleets that I already know are wrong. I flagged them internally twice. The response has been that the vehicles are being maintained according to manufacturer spec, which is technically accurate. Technically. Yes. Manufacturer spec is a floor, Mason said. It's the minimum required to not void a warranty. It's not a diagnostic protocol. If you're following spec and the same faults are cycling every 8 to 12 weeks, spec is not the problem you need to solve. She looked at him for a moment. Then she pulled up the fleet records on the room's display screen and said, "Tell me what you see." He looked for 40 minutes without saying much. She watched him look, which he was aware of but didn't find distracting. He made notes in the pad he'd brought, wrote down vehicle IDs and fault codes and the dates between recurrences, and built a rough pattern map in his own shorthand that he knew he'd need to transfer to something shareable eventually, but that right now just needed to exist so he could see the shape of it. The shape, when it emerged, was not a surprise. It was the thing he'd expected to find, which was both satisfying and not. Satisfying because his read had been right. Not satisfying because what it meant was that money had been leaving this operation for at least 18 months through the same hole that nobody had bothered to properly examine. 12 vehicles in Fleet B, he said. Recurring fault in the exhaust after-treatment system. They've replaced the diesel particulate filters 3 times in 14 months on 4 of these units. That's in the records, yes. They shouldn't have replaced them once. Claire was quiet. The DPF fault is real, Mason said. The filters are genuinely getting clogged, but they're getting clogged because the regeneration cycle isn't completing, which means the engine control unit is being fed a parameter that's out of range, and it's cutting the regen cycle short. He looked at her. What's the primary operating profile for these vehicles? Short haul, lots of stop-start, urban routes? Medical supply delivery. Mostly within the city. There's your answer. The DPF regeneration requires sustained highway speed operation to complete properly. These trucks aren't getting it. Over time, the soot load builds past the point where passive regeneration can handle it. The active regen gets interrupted by the duty cycle, and the filter clogs. He set down the pen. The fix is a forced regen cycle done in a controlled setting, a recalibration of the regen trigger thresholds for the operating profile, and a maintenance schedule that accounts for the actual duty cycle instead of the generic interval. How much would that cost? Per vehicle, maybe 4 hours of labor, and a calibration, no parts. Claire looked at the screen, where 3 filter replacements per 4 vehicles sat in the records like small, expensive monuments to the wrong question. A DPF filter on a commercial unit ran $800 to $1,200. 4 vehicles, 3 replacements each. She did the math. He watched her do it. Almost $15,000, she said, in parts alone. Plus labor. Plus labor. She leaned back. On a problem that could have been fixed for under $2,000. On 12 vehicles, he said. Not 4. I'd expect to find the same pattern in the other 8. They're probably at different stages of the cycle, but they'll get there. She looked at the fleet record for a long moment. Then at Mason. I need to tell Arya about this. I know. I'll have a written summary for you by end of week, documented, specific, with the corrective action for each vehicle. He picked up his pen again. This is the first one. I've been in these records for 40 minutes. I'll need the full 3 years to do it properly. How long will that take you? Give me 3 weeks. She nodded once, the decisive nod of someone who'd processed the relevant information and moved on from it. I'll get you full access by Monday. She stood to end the meeting, then stopped. Mr. Reed? Mason. Mason. She said it with the slight recalibration of someone adjusting to a new setting. For what it's worth, I've been asking my team to look harder at these cycles for a year. Nobody found this. He wasn't sure what she wanted him to do with that, so he said the true thing, which was, they were looking at the codes. You have to look past the codes. Is that something you can actually teach someone, or is it just... She gestured vaguely. It's teachable, he said. It takes time. We have time, she said. And this time she did smile, briefly, the way people smiled when they'd made a decision they hadn't quite made when they walked into the room. January arrived with the particular indifference of Chicago January, gray, cold, matter-of-fact about it, offering no comfort and no apology. Mason split his time in the way he'd described to Arya: 3 days a week at the shop, 2 days at Sterling or on-site at client operations, Fridays flexible. Darius had stepped into more responsibility with the reliability Mason had hoped for, and a new problem Mason hadn't anticipated, which was that the additional responsibility had made him overconfident in exactly the areas where confidence should still be conditional. Mason addressed this twice, directly, and by the third week Darius had started asking before concluding, which was all that was needed. Priya had been the actual surprise. Within 2 weeks of Mason reducing his shop hours, she had reorganized the client intake process in a way that reduced scheduling conflicts by about 30%, a change so sensible that Mason's main reaction was irritation at himself for not having done it sooner. When he told her it was good work, she said, "I know," without looking up from what she was doing, which was exactly the right answer. The Sterling audit took 4 weeks instead of 3, which he'd told Claire might happen if the records were as tangled as the first set suggested, and they were. By the time he filed the final written summary, he'd identified 6 systemic issues across 3 fleets, all of them variations on the same underlying problem: maintenance protocols built around generic manufacturer schedules that didn't account for actual operating conditions, producing repair cycles that address symptoms instead of causes. Total corrective cost: $31,400 across all 6 issues. Estimated savings over 18 months if the corrections were implemented: roughly $290,000 in avoided repeat repairs. He sent the summary to Claire on a Friday evening. She forwarded it to Arya with a one-line note that he saw only because Arya replied all when she responded, "This is why I went and got him." He read that in the truck on the way to pick up Noah from his after-school program, and then put the phone in his jacket pocket and thought about it for the length of 2 traffic lights before he made himself stop. The report, the original Reed report, the failure analysis he'd written in 2019, was published in the Journal of Automotive Systems Engineering on February 11th, a Thursday, 71 days after the contract was signed. He found out from Dr. Lund, who called him at 7 in the morning while he was making Noah's lunch. "It's live," she said. "The journal's website. Full publication, author credit, complete methodology intact. They ran a brief editorial note acknowledging the documentation gap since the original submission. It's..." She paused, which was not something she did often. "It's the right version, Mason. They didn't change anything." He stood at the kitchen counter with the lunch bag half assembled and the phone against his ear and said nothing for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she repeated. "That's all you have?" "I don't know what else to say." "You could say thank you since I reviewed that contract 3 times. "Thank you, Patricia." "You're welcome." Her voice changed slightly, the crisp professional register dropping a fraction. "It should have been published 6 years ago. I'm glad it's out." He finished the lunch, put it in Noah's bag. Noah appeared from the hallway in various stages of being ready for school, jacket on, one shoe on, the other in his hand for reasons Mason had learned not to question, and stopped when he saw Mason's face. "What happened?" Noah said. "The report got published." Noah looked at him for a moment. "The car report, your report." "Yeah." Noah sat down on the floor and put his shoe on. He was quiet for a bit, lacing it with the focused attention he gave to things when he was thinking about something else. Then he said, without looking up, "Does that mean people will know now? That you were right?" "People who read that kind of thing, yeah." "Will the Cassian people see it?" "Probably." Noah finished the lace, stood up. He was looking at Mason with the specific expression that Mason had been seeing on his son's face for years and never had a complete name for: a combination of pride and protectiveness and something older than his age that had been put there by the years of watching his father carry something quietly. "Good," Noah said, "just that." "Then, can we get breakfast burritos?" "You have cereal." "The cereal is bad." "The cereal is fine." "Dad, it's a big day. We should have burritos." Mason looked at his son, at the jacket slightly crooked, the backpack with the drawing on the front pocket that Noah had done in marker 2 years ago, and refused to let Mason replace even though the bag was visibly aging. At the face that was going to grow into something specific and good, he thought. Something he'd have had a hand in without deserving all the credit for it. Burritos, he said. Noah grabbed his bag. I knew it. Whoa. The call from Cassian came that afternoon. Mason was at Sterling's offices reviewing the corrective action plan for Fleet B's DPF issue with Claire and two of her operations managers when his phone buzzed with a number he didn't immediately recognize, area code 312. He let it go to voicemail. Checked the voicemail in the hallway 10 minutes later. The voice belonged to a man who identified himself as Richard Calloway, Senior Vice President of Engineering for Cassian Motors North America. The message was carefully worded, formal, neutral, the kind of language drafted by someone in legal before it was spoken by someone in management. It said that Cassian was aware of the publication, that leadership wished to arrange a call at Mason's earliest convenience to discuss the report and its implications, and that Cassian recognized the significance of the engineering findings documented therein. Recognized the significance. He listened to it twice. Then he walked back into the meeting. Claire looked up. Everything okay? Cassian called. The two operations managers looked at each other briefly, a look that told Mason the gala video had made its way through the Sterling offices thoroughly enough that even people who hadn't been there understood the basic shape of what it meant. Claire said, "What do they want?" "A call. To discuss the report." He sat back down. "I'll call them back after this meeting." "You don't seem very—" She searched for the word. "Affected." "I'm affected," he said. "I'm just finishing this first." He returned his attention to the corrective action plan. The DPF recalibration sequence needed a timeline and a vendor for the forced regen equipment. And that was a concrete problem with a concrete solution. And right now that was the thing in front of him. But in the part of his mind that ran parallel to the work, the part that kept processing while the hands were busy, the part that had been running some version of this calculation for 6 years, something had shifted into a different position, like a component finding its proper seat after years of operating just slightly off alignment, producing wear that was too gradual to flag, but too constant to ignore. He called Richard Calloway back at 5:15 from the truck before he picked up Noah. Calloway answered on the second ring. He was 60 or so, Mason guessed from the voice. The careful enunciation of a man who'd spent 40 years in corporate rooms. The opening pleasantries were brief and slightly awkward, which Mason expected. "Mr. Reed," Calloway said, "I want to be direct with you." "I'd prefer it." A brief pause, as if the directness request required adjustment. "The publication of your 2019 analysis it's generated significant internal discussion here. The findings and the documentation of the timeline of your original submission have raised questions at the leadership level about the decisions made at that time." Mason waited. "We believe there were failures in our internal review process," Calloway continued. "Decisions were made to delay action on the PMS fault that, in retrospect, were not in keeping with the engineering standards we hold ourselves to." "In retrospect," Mason said. A pause. "Yes." "The decisions were made in prospect," Mason said. "At the time. With full knowledge of the documented failure mode. I was in the room for some of those conversations, Mr. Calloway." The silence that followed was longer. "I understand." "I'm not sure you do, but go ahead." Another adjustment on the other end. He could hear it, the careful recalibration of someone who'd expected contrition or gratitude and was getting neither. "We'd like to discuss, formally, the circumstances of your departure from Cassian. There are people here who feel that the situation was handled poorly and that some acknowledgement of that is warranted." "Acknowledgement," Mason repeated. "And potentially, depending on the conversation, some form of, correction of the record." He looked through the windshield. The afternoon was the specific flat gray of Chicago February, the light gone early and without ceremony. Down the block, a woman was walking a dog that clearly did not want to be walked, and the negotiation between them was not going well for either party. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "I have a contract with Sterling Industries that I'm in the early stages of fulfilling. I have a repair shop in Pilsen that serves about 60 regular clients. I have a published engineering report that is now in the public record under my name. And I have a son who has a science fair project due in 3 weeks that I have promised to help with. He kept his voice level. What I don't have is time for a conversation about acknowledgement that doesn't specify what that word means in practice. A long pause. What would you need it to mean? That's a better question. He started the truck. Send me something specific in writing, what you're proposing, what form it takes, what the timeline is. I'll look at it. We can do that. Good. And Mr. Calloway. He shifted into drive. I need you to know something. I didn't push for that report to be published to make Cassian look bad. I pushed for it because the fault is real, and there are 9 vehicles in the world with that system, and the people who own them and drive in them deserve to have accurate documentation available. That's the whole reason. A pause. I understand. I hope so, Mason said, and ended the call. He drove to Noah's after-school program through the gray February afternoon, the truck's heater doing its competent, unglamorous work, the radio off. He thought about the Calloway call the way he thought about diagnostic results. Not yet, not the full processing, just taking in what was there and letting it sit before he decided what it meant. 6 years. A published report. A car fixed in 88 seconds in front of 400 people. A contract with a specific clause. A call from the company that had buried his work and then let him go, calling now with the word acknowledgement in their mouth, like it was a thing they'd invented. He didn't feel triumphant. He wasn't sure what he felt exactly. He parked outside the after-school building and sat for a moment. Inside, Noah was probably doing the last 20 minutes of whatever structured activity they had on Thursdays, waiting for the sound of the truck, which he could apparently identify by engine tone from inside the building, a fact Mason had discovered when Noah had come out the door 17 seconds after he pulled up without being called. He thought about what Dr. Lund had said on Sunday morning, that first morning after the gala. Let it matter. Without immediately moving on to the next thing to worry about. He was still working on that part. The door of the building opened and Noah came out, backpack on, and he spotted the truck and raised one hand in the unselfconscious wave of a kid who had not yet learned to make that gesture smaller. Mason raised a hand back through the windshield. Noah got in, dropped the backpack, buckled up, then looked at his father with that specific reading the room ability that he'd been deploying since he was about 5. Something happened, Noah said. Cassian called. Noah went very still. What did they say? They want to have a conversation about making things right. Noah processed this. Are they sorry? Mason thought about Richard Calloway's voice. The careful language, the legal caution woven through every sentence. The word acknowledgement doing the work of a more direct word that hadn't been offered. They're sorry it came out, he said. Whether that's the same as being sorry it happened, I don't know yet. Noah was quiet for a moment. Is that enough? It was the kind of question that sounded simple and wasn't, and Noah had been asking that kind of question since he was 6, and Mason had never stopped being slightly surprised by it. I don't know yet, Mason said again, but I'm going to find out. He pulled out of the parking spot and onto the street. Noah reached into his backpack and pulled out a crumpled sheet of paper that appeared to be the science fair project outline, which he smoothed on his knee and began studying with the expression of someone who had suddenly remembered a deadline. The project, Mason said. I have ideas, Noah said. I was thinking, can it be about engine diagnostics? It can be about anything in physics or chemistry. Engine diagnostics is physics. It's engineering. Engineering is applied physics. Mason glanced at him. The paper, now flat on his knee, had a title written at the top in Noah's handwriting, Why Computers Lie and What the Real Problem Is. He looked back at the road. That's actually not bad, he said. I know, said Noah. You taught me that. Pass. 3 days later, Claire forwarded Mason an email from one of the 4 freight consulting clients, a mid-size regional carrier out of Rockford named Heartline Logistics, that said, simply, that they had implemented the corrective maintenance protocol Mason had outlined for their fleet's after-treatment system, that 3 vehicles had completed the forced regeneration without issue, and that the operations manager wanted to schedule a call to discuss expanding the diagnostic framework to their second fleet. Mason read it, replied that he was available Wednesday, CC'd Claire. Then he went to the bench, picked up his pen, and kept working. The written proposal from Cassian arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Richard Calloway's call, in a PDF that ran to 11 pages and had clearly been reviewed by at least 4 different lawyers before it was sent. Mason read it at the kitchen table after Noah was in bed, with the kind of coffee that was more habit than need at that hour, and worked through it the way he worked through everything, sequentially, without skipping ahead, letting each piece sit before moving to the next. The document was more than he'd expected and less than it should have been, which put it somewhere in the range of honest. What Cassian proposed, in the language that legal departments used when they were trying to be generous while minimizing exposure. A formal written acknowledgement that Mason's 2019 failure analysis had been received, reviewed, and set aside for reasons that did not reflect the quality of the engineering. A retroactive correction to his personnel file, removing the performance-based language that had been added in his final year. A financial settlement for the circumstances of his departure. The number left blank for negotiation. And a statement to be released through Cassian's North American communications team acknowledging the Reed report and its contribution to understanding the third-generation PMS failure mode. He read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at the wall for a while. The thing about vindication, the real thing, not the idea of it, was that it didn't feel the way he'd imagined it might, in the years when he'd let himself imagine it. It didn't feel like arrival. It felt more like standing at a place you'd been trying to reach for a long time and finding that it was just a place. Real and solid underfoot, but still just ground. He'd been right. He'd always known he'd been right. What Cassian was offering now was the formal permission for the rest of the world to know it, which was valuable, and also, at this particular hour, at this particular kitchen table, with the coffee going cold and Noah asleep down the hall, not the most important thing he could think of. He forwarded the PDF to Dr. Lund with a message that said, "Your thoughts when you have time." Her reply came back in 4 minutes, which meant she'd been awake and waiting for it. The settlement number needs to be in the document, not left blank. That blank is a negotiation trap. Call me in the morning. He smiled at the screen, put the phone down, went to bed. He called her at 7:15. She answered mid-first ring. "The blank," she said immediately. "I know. Do not let them fill it in after you've agreed to the framework. That's the oldest move in the book. You agree to the structure and then the number they put in is insulting and you've already committed to the rest of it." She paused. "What number do you want?" He'd thought about this in the night, not obsessively but clearly, the way you thought about things that had a right answer if you were honest with yourself about what they were actually worth, what it had cost him. The 2 years of being sidelined before the firing, the gap in his career, the savings he'd pulled from, the repair shop built from scratch because there was no other option. Noah and the eggs. The 4 years of working every day in a space that was good and real and his, but was also smaller than what he could have been doing. He gave her a number. She was quiet for a moment. "That's fair," she said. "It's not punitive." "No, it's accurate." She paused. "Is that intentional?" "Yeah." He watched the coffee maker do its work. "I don't want to punish them. I want the record to be correct. The settlement is part of the record. It should reflect what actually happened, not what I can extract from them. You know, most lawyers would tell you that's leaving money on the table." "I know." "I'm not going to tell you that," she said, "because I think you're right, but I want to make sure you know what you're choosing." "I know what I'm choosing." She made the sound that meant she'd processed and moved on. "I'll draft a counter. You'll have it by noon." The counter went back to Cassian on a Thursday. By the following Monday, they'd agreed to everything. The acknowledgement language, the personnel file correction, the settlement at the number Mason had named, and the communications statement, which was to be released simultaneously with a formal letter sent to the Journal of Automotive Systems Engineering acknowledging the report's significance and Cassian's failure to act on its original submission. That last piece had been Mason's addition to the counter, not Dr. Lund's. She'd looked at it and said, "That's the one they'll push back on hardest." And he'd said, "I know." And they had pushed back twice, and he had held on it both times. And eventually they had agreed because the alternative, being the company that refused to formally acknowledge suppressing a valid safety report while the report was already published and publicly attributed, was worse than the acknowledgement itself. The letter went to the Journal on a Wednesday in late February. Mason saw the confirmation email from Cassian's communications team and read it standing in the shop bay with his jacket still on from the cold outside, and felt something settle in his chest that had been slightly unsettled for 6 years. Not healed, not resolved in the clean, narrative sense, just properly documented. The record was correct now. What had happened, and the record said so, and that was the most you could ask of a record. He went back to work. Geek. March came in hard, and then softened unexpectedly in its second week, the way Chicago March occasionally did. A surprise run of days in the low 50s that everyone received with the specific gratitude of people who had learned not to trust it but also couldn't help themselves. Mason had the bay doors open for the first time since October, and the smell of the neighborhood in almost spring came through. Exhaust and lake, and something indefinably alive that the city always produced when the temperature crossed a threshold. Noah's science fair project, Why Computers Lie and What the Real Problem Is, had placed second in the district competition on a Saturday in early March, losing to a project about water filtration that Mason thought was genuinely excellent and told Noah so, which Noah accepted with more grace than Mason might have managed at 8. They'd gone for pizza afterward, the good kind from the place on 18th that Noah had been requesting for 2 years based on a recommendation from a classmate, and it had been exactly as good as advertised, which was a rarer outcome than people acknowledged. Over pizza, Noah had said, "I think second is okay if the other thing was actually better." "It was better," Mason said. "The water filtration thing solves a real problem. Yours solves a real problem, too. The diagnostic problem is already being solved. By me. Professionally." He'd said it slightly dryly, and Noah had grinned. "Is that allowed? Like, is it cheating if you're already doing the thing your project is about?" "The project is about the concept. The concept is independent." "That sounds like a technicality." "It is a technicality, a valid one." And Noah had eaten his pizza and thought about it, and then said, "I think I want to be an engineer," with the confidence of someone making a decision rather than expressing a wish. "You've said that before," Mason said. "I mean it more now." "Why now?" Noah had looked at him across the table in the specific way he looked at things when he was being completely serious, the way that still occasionally surprised Mason with its directness. "Because I watched you," he said. "Not just at the gala. Like, I've been watching you for years. You know things and you trust what you know even when other people don't. And things work when you're done with them." He picked up his pizza again. "I want to be like that." Mason had not known what to say to that, which was a familiar condition when Noah was being particularly himself. He'd said, "Eat your pizza," and Noah had. And they'd driven home through the warming March evening with the radio on, and Mason had held on to the thing Noah had said the same way he'd learned to hold on to other things that mattered, carefully, without squeezing, letting it be what it was. The Sterling work had expanded by March in ways that Claire documented in a quarterly review document that Mason read with the same careful attention he gave to maintenance records, because the patterns in one were not so different from the patterns in the other. 3 consulting clients had implemented the diagnostic framework he'd built. 2 of them had reported measurable reductions in repeat repair cycles within the first 60 days. The third was still in the implementation phase, which Mason had told Claire was normal and would resolve by the end of the quarter. He'd also, in February, spent 2 full days at Sterling's offices running a training session with Claire's 3 existing consultants, the 2 from logistics backgrounds and the 1 from fleet insurance. He'd been honest with Arya about his expectations going in. One of the 3 would get it quickly, one would get it slowly, and one might not get it at all in the way he meant it, which wasn't a failure of effort, but of fit. He'd been right about the distribution, though he'd gotten the order wrong about which consultant fell into which category. Marcus, the fleet insurance background, whom he'd expected to struggle most, had turned out to have a natural instinct for reading upstream cause from downstream symptom, something in the way insurance work trained you to ask where the thing actually started, not just where it manifested. By the second day, he'd been asking questions that were ahead of where Mason had planned to be, and Mason had adjusted and let him run. Sandra, one of the logistics consultants, had the opposite problem, She was very good at systems thinking at the operational level, but the mechanical specificity was new territory, and new territory at 43 was harder than at 23. And she was too professional to pretend otherwise and too proud to ask for help without prompting. Mason had started dropping by her desk with specific examples, not instruction, just examples, framed as thoughts rather than lessons. And by the third week, she'd started sending him questions by email, which was the actual thing he'd been working toward. The third consultant, Derek, was smart and technically proficient and fundamentally not interested in the diagnostic approach, which Mason had concluded by the end of the first day and confirmed over the following 2 weeks. Derek was excellent at cost analysis and vendor management and the operational side of fleet consulting, and those were real and valuable skills, and the diagnostic framework was not going to be where he contributed. Mason had told Claire this privately and without editorializing, and Claire had nodded the decisive nod and rearranged the role allocation accordingly. And Derek had seemed, if anything, relieved. He told Arya about this in one of their bi-weekly check-ins, which had evolved from formal meetings in conference rooms to something slightly less formal. Usually coffee, sometimes in her office, occasionally at the shop if she was on the south side for something else. She'd started showing up at the shop with less ceremony over time, pulling a stool up to the workbench the way someone did when they were no longer performing comfort with a space and were actually comfortable in it. Derek knew he wasn't the right fit for the diagnostic side, she said. I think he knew from the first day. He just didn't have language for it that didn't sound like failure. Mason shrugged. Most people don't want to admit what they're not good at until someone makes it safe to. It's faster if you just make it safe to. Arya looked at him over her coffee. You do that a lot. Make it safe for people to say what's actually true. It's practical. If someone's pretending to know something they don't, I'm going to spend twice as long fixing the downstream effects. Is that the only reason? He considered this. No, he said, but it's a reason. She smiled. Not the event smile, not the professional one, the actual one, which was smaller and crooked on one side and appeared rarely enough that he'd learned to notice it. I'm going to use that in my next all hands, she said, without attribution. I'll invoice you. Add it to the consulting fee. It was Arya who brought up the cardiac wing in April in a way that Mason hadn't expected. Not as an update, not as a business item, but as something she'd been sitting with. They were in her office on a Tuesday afternoon, late, the light coming through the windows in the specific long-angle way of Chicago April at 5 o'clock, and she said, almost without transition from the operational conversation they'd been having, the wing opened last week. He looked up from the report he'd been referencing. The cardiac wing? At Lakeview General. They did a soft opening. I went on Thursday. She was looking out the window, not at him. They have 12 beds in the pediatric section. The ones that were on the waiting list, most of them have been scheduled. She paused. There's a boy, 7 years old. He's been waiting since August. Mason said nothing. He's from Pilsen, actually, she said. His family, they don't have a lot. The insurance situation is... She stopped. Anyway, he's scheduled for surgery in May. He looked at her. She was still looking at the window, and he could see on her face the things she didn't always let be visible. The actual weight of it, the gap between the scale at which she operated, and the specific human cost of things that fell through the cracks in that scale. That's why you did the gala, he said. That's why I did the gala. She turned from the window. Not for the press, not for the tax implications, not even, if I'm being completely honest, primarily for the reputation. Because there was a 7-year-old boy from Pilsen on a waiting list, and the money existed in this world to get him off it, and it wasn't getting to where it needed to be. She said it flatly, without sentimentality, which was the only way she could say things like this without them becoming something else. I needed the car to work. The car worked. It worked because of you. He shifted. It worked because the fault was fixable. Someone had to do it. But no one did, she said. Until you. He sat with that for a moment. The thing about Arya Sterling, he'd come to understand over the months of working alongside her, was that she was not a simple person pretending to be simple. She was genuinely complicated, driven by things that she couldn't always articulate cleanly, operating from a mix of calculation and feeling that she kept more separated than they actually were, and occasionally surprised by the gap between what she thought motivated her and what actually did. He'd watched her figure that out over 4 months, slowly and imperfectly, in the way people figured out real things. Not in a single moment, but in accumulation. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Go ahead." "The way you evaluate people, the credentials, the titles. You said at the shop that you wanted to change that. Have you?" She looked at him steadily. "I'm trying to. It's slower than I thought." She paused. "The instinct is deep. You build a filter over enough years and it stops feeling like a filter and starts feeling like judgment. Like the same thing." "They're not the same thing." "I know that now." She said it without self-congratulation, which was the right way to say it. "I had 3 candidates for a division director role last month. My initial read before I looked carefully was toward the one with the most institutional name on his resume. My actual read after I looked at what they'd each actually done, it was a different person. Someone who'd built something from the ground up, smaller, but more real." She paused. "I almost didn't see it." "But you did." "I did. Because I'd been paying attention to a different example of that for 4 months. She said it without coyness, directly, the way she said things when she meant them. "You're not a lesson I learned and filed away. You're someone I work with. That's different." He didn't know exactly what to do with that, so he did what he usually did with things he didn't know what to do with. He let it sit, acknowledged it without deflecting it, and moved on to what was next. "The boy from Pilsen," he said. "When's his surgery?" "May 12th. He nodded. "Tell me how it goes." "I will," she said. Spring settled into Chicago with the gradual decisiveness of something that had been delayed long enough and was now committing. The trees on the block behind the shop came into leaf over 2 weeks in late April, and Noah documented this with a specificity that Mason found both excessive and completely in character. A hand-drawn chart on graph paper tracking the leaf progression on 3 different trees, dated daily, which he'd taped to the wall above his desk next to the Y Computer's Lie poster. When Mason pointed out that this was, arguably, more work than the science fair project, Noah said, "The science fair project was for school. This is for me." And that was, Mason thought, the exact right answer. Darius had asked for a raise in April, which Mason had given him, not because Darius had asked perfectly. He hadn't. He'd done it awkwardly, in the middle of a different conversation, in the way young people asked for things when they weren't sure they deserved them yet, but because he deserved it, and Mason had been planning to offer it in May anyway. He'd told Darius this, that he'd been planning to offer it, and Darius had said, "So I asked too early?" And Mason had said, "You asked at the right time, you just didn't know it," which Darius had thought about for the rest of the afternoon. Priya had not asked for a raise. She'd quietly renegotiated her hours instead. Fewer on Saturdays, a standing block on Tuesday mornings for a course she was apparently taking at the community college in automotive engineering, which Mason had found out not from her but from Darius, who had mentioned it in passing as if it were common knowledge. When Mason brought it up with her directly, she'd looked at him with the expression she deployed when she thought something was obvious. "I'm going back," she said. "Not full-time, just finishing what I started." "Good," he said. She went back to the brake job she was doing. "You're not going to say anything else about it?" "What else is there to say?" She thought about that for a moment. "Most people would say it's a good idea or ask why or..." "It is a good idea," Mason said. "And I already know why." She looked at him. "How?" "Because you've been doing engineering every day since you started here. You just haven't been calling it that." She turned back to the brake job. He thought for a moment that she wasn't going to say anything else. Then she said quietly, "That's what I needed to hear about a year ago." "I know," he said. "I should have said it sooner." She didn't respond to that, but she didn't need to. The thing about the story, and Mason had become aware by now that there was a story, that the 43 seconds of phone footage had continued moving through the world in the way things moved now, accumulating views and comments and occasional press inquiries that Devon fielded on Arya's behalf. The thing about the story was that it kept being told wrong. Not maliciously, just incompletely, the way most stories got told when the people doing the telling hadn't been in the room. The version that circulated was this: a forgotten genius fixes an unfixable car in 90 seconds, and a billionaire recognizes his brilliance and rescues him from obscurity. It was a satisfying version. It had a clean shape. It fit in a headline. It was also, in the ways that mattered, inaccurate. Mason wasn't a forgotten genius. He was a good engineer who'd been right about something and punished for it, which happened to people all the time and didn't require genius, just competence and bad institutional luck. He hadn't been rescued from obscurity. He'd built something in Pilsen that was real and served real people, and that wasn't obscurity. That was just a different scale than the one the story wanted to use. And Arya hadn't rescued him. She'd recognized something and offered a door, and he'd walked through it on his own terms, with a contract that said what the terms were. The difference mattered. He'd thought about why it mattered and arrived at something that wasn't quite a philosophy but was close to one, that the rescue narrative, the genius-discovered narrative, made the person being recognized passive, made them the object of someone else's discernment rather than an agent in their own right. And that framing, the idea that value was something conferred from above rather than something that existed independently, was exactly the framing that had allowed the suppression to happen in the first place. The people at Cassian who'd buried the report hadn't thought of it as suppression. They'd thought of it as a resource allocation decision, a judgment call about whose knowledge was worth acting on. Mason's value, in their framing, was something they got to assess and assign. He didn't accept that framing then. He didn't accept it now, even when the story being told was favorable. He'd mentioned something like this to Noah in late April, not as a lecture. He'd learned years ago that Noah processed lectures by not processing them, that the indirect approach was more effective, but as a thought, out loud, while they were driving back from the hardware store on a Saturday morning. "The stuff people are writing about the gala," Mason said. "Have you seen any of it?" Noah had seen it. He was 9 and had a tablet and knew how to use a search bar. "Yeah," he said. "What do you think?" Noah looked out the window, thought about it in the genuine way he thought about things. "I think they make it sound like you needed her," he said, "like you were waiting." "Were you waiting?" "No." He said it simply. "You were working." "Right. And she was also working. And then you did the thing at the gala, and it made sense for you to work together." He looked at Mason. "That's not the same as needing someone to save you." Mason looked at the road. "No," he said, "it's not." "The story they're telling is easier," Noah said, "because people like when someone gets saved. It's a better feeling than 2 people figured out they were useful to each other." He was 9 years old. "That's true," Mason said, "but the true version is the one that's actually useful, because the true version tells you something you can use." "What does it tell you?" He thought about this properly, the way he thought about things that deserved more than a quick answer. It tells you that worth doesn't disappear when no one's looking at it. It tells you that doing the work matters even when the work isn't being seen. And it tells you that when things do change, and they can change, they're not fixed, it's usually because you kept doing the thing you knew how to do, and eventually that became undeniable. Noah was quiet for a moment. "That's less satisfying than the rescue story." "Yeah," Mason said, "but it's more true. And in the long run, true things are more useful than satisfying ones." Noah looked out the window again. "I think I want to write that down. Write it in your own words." "What if your words are better?" "They won't mean as much in my words." Noah made a face. "You always say stuff like that, and you always remember it anyway." May 12th came on a Thursday. Mason was at the Sterling offices in the morning, working through a revised version of the diagnostic framework with Marcus, who had, over 2 months, become genuinely excellent at it, better than Mason had expected, with a natural fluency that made Mason think he'd been underused in his previous role and probably knew it, when his phone buzzed. A text from Arya. "He's out of surgery." It went well. He looked at it for a moment. Then he set the phone face down on the table and went back to the framework. Marcus noticed. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," Mason said. "Good news." He texted back that evening. Glad to hear it. Arya's reply came 20 minutes later. His name is Diego. His mom says he wants to be a race car driver. Mason read that. Looked at it for a while. Tell him the cars are engineered first, he wrote back. 3 dots appeared. Then, I'll pass it along. The Cassian communications statement went out the following week, on a Tuesday, through their standard press channels. It was 4 paragraphs, formal and carefully worded, and it said, in the language that legal departments used when they were trying to be accurate while minimizing the appearance of liability, that Cassian Motors acknowledged the significant engineering contribution represented by the Reed report, that the company recognized the report had been received internally in 2019, and that the decision not to act on its findings at that time had been an error in judgment. That Cassian was committed to incorporating the findings into their ongoing PMS documentation and owner communications for all existing Vega units, and that Mason T. Reed's contribution to automotive safety engineering was both substantial and, in Cassian's view, long overdue for formal recognition. Long overdue. Someone in their legal department had let that phrase through, and Mason thought about it when he read it. Whether it was a concession or just language, whether there was a meaningful difference, and whether, at this point, the distinction mattered to him the way it once had. He decided it didn't, not because it wasn't true, but because the document existed. The statement was public. The report was published. The settlement was paid. These were facts in the world now, and facts didn't require him to feel a particular way about them to be real. He called Dr. Lund when he'd read it. I saw it, she said. I've been waiting for you to call. What do you think? I think it's correct, and I think it took them 3 years longer than it should have, and I think that's both infuriating and completely predictable, and I think you handled the whole thing with more patience than I would have. She paused. What do you think? He was in the shop, afternoon light coming through the bay doors, the block settling into late-day rhythms, Darius in the far bay. The smell of oil and metal that he'd been in the middle of for 4 years and that had become, without his quite noticing it, a smell that meant something specific to him. I think I'm glad it's done, he said. That's all? And I think the 7 vehicles in the world with a 3rd-gen PMS are now covered by a published failure protocol that any engineer can access, and the owners are going to receive updated documentation from Cassian, and someone in the future who has the same problem I had at that gala is going to be able to look it up. He paused. That's the part that matters. That's always been the part that mattered to you, she said. Not a compliment, just a fact. It's what made the report good. The report was good, he said. It was, she agreed. It is, but Noah turned 9 in the last week of May, which he announced several times in the preceding 2 weeks, in the way he announced things he was looking forward to, not obsessively, just periodically, as reminders, as if Mason might have forgotten and needed updating. Mason hadn't forgotten. He'd been planning since March. The party was small. 6 kids from school, pizza, a cake that Mason had baked himself from a recipe his own mother had used, which he'd made twice in practice and gotten mostly right, though the frosting had a tendency to slide on one side that he'd accepted as a feature. At some point during the party, one of Noah's friends, a kid named Theo, small and serious, who Mason had met twice before, wandered into the garage portion of the shop, which was accessible from the backyard, and stood there looking at the tools and the lift and the current job on the rack, which was a vintage 1981 pickup truck that a client named Robert had brought in for a full restoration, and that Mason had been working on as a slow project between other jobs because he found it interesting and because Robert was not in a hurry. Theo stood and looked at the shop for a while. Then he said to Mason, who had followed him in, "Is this where you fixed the car? The one on the internet?" "No," Mason said. "That was somewhere else. But this is where I work. My dad says you're famous now." "Your dad is being generous." Theo considered the shop seriously. "I think it's cool," he said, "that you know how to fix things." "You can learn how to fix things," Mason said, "if you're interested." "How?" "By working on them, starting with small problems and understanding them completely before moving to big ones." He looked at the kid. "And by not being embarrassed to ask questions." Theo thought about this. Noah knows a lot about cars, he said. He's been listening for a while. He says you taught him that computers can lie. Computers report what they're measuring. Sometimes they're measuring the wrong thing. Theo nodded slowly, processing this with the particular concentration of a 9-year-old who was actually interested. My tablet does that, he said. Like, it says the battery is at 40% and then it dies. Exactly like that, Mason said. The sensor is right, but it's not reading the actual charge correctly. The measurement is accurate. The calibration is off. So how do you fix it? For a tablet, you run it all the way to 0 and charge it to 100 a few times. Recalibrates the measurement baseline. He looked at the kid. For a car, it's more complicated, but the principle is the same. Theo looked at him for another moment. Then with complete seriousness, can I come back sometime and see how you fix things? Mason looked at the kid, thought about being 22 and walking into his first engineering job with everything he didn't know yet and no particular map for the territory. Thought about the things that had been given to him then. Time, explanation, the particular patience of a professor who treated questions as legitimate rather than inconvenient. Yeah, he said, come back. Bring Noah. Theo went back to the party. Mason stood in the shop for a moment, in the late May light coming through the open bay door, the 1981 pickup on the lift above him, the tools along the left wall in the order he'd developed over 4 years of learning what he needed, where, and when. He heard Noah's voice from the yard. Some argument about the rules of a game that was resolving itself the way these things resolved, through negotiation and compromise and the eventual agreement of a group of 9-year-olds who'd rather play than be right. Noah's voice in the middle of it, firm but not heated, making a case for something. Mason listened to it for a second. Then he went inside. Later that night, after the other kids had gone home, and the cake was mostly gone, and Noah had examined his birthday presents with the methodical pleasure of someone who appreciated things rather than just receiving them, they sat in the living room with the television off and the evening coming through the window in its final light. Noah was looking at one of the presents, a technical manual for automotive electrical systems that he'd specifically requested, which Mason had ordered and which had arrived 2 days ago, and which he'd wrapped, and which Noah had opened with the expression of someone who was genuinely happy about a technical manual, which said everything about who Noah was. Dad, Noah said, without looking up from the manual. Yeah. Do you think things are different now? Like, for real different, not just temporarily? It was the kind of question that Noah asked and then didn't push on, leaving space for the actual answer rather than a quick one. Mason looked at the ceiling, thought about it. Some things, he said. The report is published, and that's permanent. The record at Cassian is corrected, and that's permanent. The work at Sterling, that's real, and it's building. He paused. Those are different. What about for you, like you specifically? He thought about that separately, because it deserved to be separate. I think I trust my own judgment differently than I used to, he said. Not more than I did before. I always trusted it. But there was this layer of, he looked for the right word. Doubt. Not about the work, about whether the work being real meant it would be recognized, whether right was enough. Is it enough? It's necessary, he said, but not sufficient. You also have to stay. You have to stay in the work and stay in the field and not let the people who pushed you out determine where you end up. He looked at his son. That's the part I almost got wrong. I almost let what happened at Cassian define the boundaries of what I thought I could do. But you didn't, Noah said. I didn't, but it wasn't a sure thing. It could have gone the other way. Noah was quiet for a moment, the manual open on his lap. What kept it from going the other way? Mason looked at him. You, partly. Me? You made a presentation, Mason said, about the car. With a slide. He paused. You wanted to see the thing, so we went, and the thing needed fixing, so I fixed it, and here we are. Noah looked back at the manual. He had a small expression that he was trying to keep small, which Mason recognized and didn't mention. I knew it was a good presentation, Noah said. It was a good presentation. I could make another one, if there's something else we should go see. I know you could, Mason said. Let's table it for now. Noah turned a page in the manual, read for a bit, Then, Dad, the boy from the hospital, Diego. What about him? Can we go see him sometime? Like, not weird. Just, he's from here and he's going to be okay now. He looked up. I think it would be good to meet someone who's going to be okay. Mason looked at his son, 9 years old today, sitting with a technical manual, thinking about a kid he'd never met, in the easy, natural way he thought about other people's situations as connected to his own, which was something that couldn't be taught, and also, Mason suspected, could be slowly lost, and which he hoped Noah would keep for a long time. I'll talk to Arya, he said. Noah nodded, satisfied, and went back to the manual. Outside, the city went on doing the thing it always did, moving through its particular night, the sound of it familiar and continuous, the kind of background that stopped being background when you paid attention to it and became, instead, something like proof that things continued. That ordinary life kept its ordinary pace around the extraordinary things that happened inside it, and that this was not indifference, but just the nature of scale, the way a neighborhood didn't stop for a single shop's best day and also somehow contained it. Mason got up to do the dishes. Noah stayed on the couch with his manual, reading about electrical systems, learning the language of things that needed to be understood before they could be fixed. It was a good birthday. It was a good day. And if that sounds like a small thing, one man, one kid, one ordinary evening in a not large apartment above a repair shop in Pilsen, then the only thing worth saying is that small things are what most of life is made of, and the people who figure out how to be inside them fully without always reaching past them towards something that seems more important are not settling for less. They're paying attention, and paying attention, as any good engineer will tell you, is where all real work begins.